The sound of distant hooves thundered across the valley as Gideon worked frantically to thresh wheat in the winepress. His hands trembled slightly, eyes darting toward the horizon where dust clouds signaled another Midianite raid approaching. For 7 long years, the people of Israel had lived in fear, hiding in caves and mountain clefts while foreign invaders destroyed their crops and slaughtered their livestock. In these desperate times, an unlikely hero would emerge. A man whose journey from fearful farmer to military commander would demonstrate the extraordinary power of faith. In those days, the Israelites had done evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he had delivered them into the hands of the Midianites. These desert raiders, along with the Amalekites and other eastern peoples, swept through the land like locusts, destroying everything in their path. They came with their livestock and tents, as numerous as swarms of locusts. The people of Israel had been reduced to poverty and starvation, crying out to the Lord for deliverance. The Lord heard their cries and sent an angel to Gideon son of Joash while he worked in secret. The angel appeared beneath an oak tree in Ophrah and greeted him with unexpected words. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon looked up, confused by the title. He was no warrior, just a frightened man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, the least important member of his family. How could this messenger address him with such confidence? Gideon responded with doubt and frustration, questioning why misfortune had befallen his people if the Lord was truly with them. Where were the wonders their ancestors had spoken about? The deliverance from Egypt? The miracles in the wilderness? The angel looked directly at Gideon with eyes that seemed to pierce his very soul and delivered the message that would change everything. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Am I not sending you?" Still doubtful, Gideon requested a sign to confirm this divine calling. He prepared an offering of meat and bread, placing it upon a rock. When the angel touched it with his staff, fire sprang from the rock, consuming the offering completely. The angel vanished, leaving Gideon trembling with fear and wonder. He had seen the angel of the Lord face to face and yet lived to tell about it. That night, Gideon built an altar and named it, "The Lord is Peace." The Lord's first command to Gideon came that very night, to tear down his father's altar to Baal and the Asherah pole beside it. This was no small request. Baal worship had infected the entire community, including Gideon's family. To destroy these idols would be seen as an act of treason and blasphemy. Fearing the townspeople's reaction, Gideon took 10 servants and worked under the cover of darkness, dismantling the pagan shrine and building a proper altar to the Lord in its place. Morning revealed Gideon's nighttime work. The men of the town were furious, demanding that Joash hand over his son to be executed. But Joash defended Gideon with unexpected wisdom. "If Baal is truly a god, let him defend himself against the one who broke down his altar." From that day, Gideon received the name Jerubbaal, meaning, "Let Baal contend with him." The idol had been proven powerless, unable even to protect its own altar. Soon after, the Midianites and their allies crossed the Jordan River, camping in the valley of Jezreel. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the men of his clan to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh and the surrounding tribes, gathering an army to face the invaders. Still uncertain, Gideon sought another sign from God, laying out a wool fleece on the threshing floor. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." God honored this request, and the next morning, Gideon wrung out a bowlful of water from the fleece while the ground remained dry. Yet doubt still lingered in his heart. Gideon asked for one more sign, this time for the fleece to remain dry while dew covered the ground. Again, God patiently demonstrated his power, fulfilling Gideon's request exactly as stated. With this final confirmation, Gideon prepared his army for battle. 32,000 men had responded to his call, gathering at the spring of Harod within sight of the Midianite camp. But the Lord had a surprising message for Gideon. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own strength has saved me.'" God instructed Gideon to announce that anyone who was fearful should depart. 22,000 men turned back, leaving only 10,000 soldiers. Still, the Lord said, "There are still too many men." God provided another test. He told Gideon to bring the men down to the water and observe how they drank. Those who knelt to drink were separated from those who cupped water in their hands and lapped it like dogs. Only 300 men lapped from their hands, remaining alert and ready. These were the chosen few, a tiny force to face a vast enemy army that spread across the valley like a plague of locusts. That night, the Lord instructed Gideon to approach the Midianite camp. If he was afraid, he could take his servant Purah and listen to what the enemy was saying. Gideon crept to the outskirts of the camp, where he overheard a man telling his companion about a dream. A round loaf of barley bread had tumbled into the Midianite camp, striking a tent with such force that it collapsed. The friend interpreted the dream. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Hearing this, Gideon worshipped God and returned to the Israelite camp with renewed confidence. He divided his 300 men into 3 companies, giving each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside. Their instructions were simple but unusual. Surround the enemy camp, blow the trumpets, break the jars to reveal the torches, and shout, "For the Lord and for Gideon." In the middle of the night, Gideon's men took their positions around the Midianite camp. At Gideon's signal, they blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, and raised their torches high, shouting their battle cry. Confusion erupted in the enemy camp. Startled from sleep, surrounded by noise and light, the Midianites panicked. The Lord caused them to turn on each other with their swords. Those who survived fled toward the Jordan River. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, calling for reinforcements to pursue the fleeing Midianites. The Ephraimites captured the fords of the Jordan and the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed these princes and brought their heads to Gideon as proof of victory. The Ephraimites were initially angry that Gideon hadn't called them earlier, but he diplomatically praised their accomplishments, soothing their wounded pride. The battle wasn't over yet. Gideon and his exhausted 300 men crossed the Jordan, pursuing the remaining Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. They arrived at Sukkot, asking for bread to feed his hungry men. The leaders of Sukkot refused, mocking Gideon's small force and doubting his ability to capture the Midianite kings. Gideon promised to return and teach them a lesson with desert thorns and briars. The people of Peniel similarly refused to help. Undeterred, Gideon continued the pursuit, eventually defeating the remaining 15,000 Midianites and capturing their kings. On his return journey, he made good on his promise to discipline the elders of Sukkot and demolish the Tower of Peniel as a warning against refusing aid to God's chosen deliverer. When Gideon questioned Zebah and Zalmunna about Israelite men they had killed at Tabor, they admitted the murders, describing their victims as having the stature of princes. These had been Gideon's brothers. With righteous anger, Gideon executed the kings who had orphaned so many Israelite children and widowed so many women during their years of oppression. After this decisive victory, the grateful Israelites asked Gideon to rule over them as king, establishing a dynasty through his descendants. Gideon refused, stating firmly, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." He recognized that Israel's true king was God himself. However, Gideon did request gold earrings from the plunder, using them to make an ephod, a priestly garment, which he placed in his town of Ophrah. Tragically, this ephod eventually became an object of worship, leading Israel back into idolatry. Despite Gideon's good intentions, his creation became a snare to him and his family. Nevertheless, during Gideon's lifetime, Israel enjoyed 40 years of peace. The Midianites never recovered from their defeat, and the land had rest from constant raids and devastation. Gideon returned to his home and had many wives who bore him 70 sons. In his later years, he lived peacefully until his death at a good old age. He was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah. Sadly, after Gideon's death, the Israelites again turned to idol worship, forgetting the Lord who had rescued them and showing no loyalty to Gideon's family despite all he had done for them. The story of Gideon reveals profound truths about God's character and his work through imperfect human instruments. God chose not a mighty warrior but a frightened farmer hiding in a winepress. He reduced an army of thousands to a mere 300 to demonstrate that victory comes not through human strength but divine power. Throughout the narrative, we see Gideon's transformation from a doubter to a deliverer, from questioning God's presence to leading God's people. Gideon's journey teaches us that God often calls the unlikely, the unqualified, and even the unwilling to accomplish his purposes. When Gideon protested his inadequacy, God didn't deny his weakness but promised his presence. "I will be with you." The Lord didn't seek out the strongest individual but rather someone who would follow his unusual battle plan, relying entirely on divine strategy rather than conventional military tactics. The reduction of Gideon's army emphasizes an important spiritual principle. God delights in working through apparent weakness to display his strength. By whittling down the forces to a number that could never succeed through their own abilities, God ensured that Israel would recognize the true source of their deliverance. This pattern appears throughout Scripture, God using the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, the weak to shame the strong. We also see in Gideon's story the patience of God with human doubt. Rather than rebuking Gideon for his requests for signs, the Lord graciously accommodated his need for confirmation. God understands our frailty and meets us in our uncertainty, providing reassurance when our faith falters. The fleece episodes demonstrate not only God's willingness to bolster wavering faith, but also his intimate involvement in human affairs. The unusual battle strategy, trumpets, empty jars, and torches, reveals God's creative approaches to seemingly impossible situations. The victory came not through superior strength or weaponry, but through obedience to divine instructions that seemed foolish by human standards. This reminds us that God's ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts higher than our thoughts. What appears ridiculous to human reasoning may be the very channel through which God chooses to work. Gideon's refusal to establish a monarchy demonstrates his understanding that Israel's true king was the Lord. Despite his fame and popularity after the victory, he recognized the danger of elevating human leadership above divine authority. This shows remarkable spiritual insight and humility, especially in a culture where military heroes typically seized power and established dynasties. Yet Gideon's story also contains a cautionary element. The ephod he created, perhaps with sincere intentions to commemorate God's deliverance, eventually became an idol that led the people astray. Even deliverers chosen by God remain fallible humans whose errors can have far-reaching consequences. This reminds us to guard our hearts against creating religious symbols or traditions that might eventually replace genuine worship of God. The aftermath of Gideon's death, Israel's return to idolatry, underscores the persistent human tendency to forget divine deliverance when immediate danger passes. Despite witnessing God's miraculous intervention, the Israelites quickly abandoned their commitment to the Lord when their human leader was no longer present. This pattern of spiritual amnesia highlights our need for consistent reminders of God's faithfulness and regular renewal of our covenant commitment. Through Gideon's story, we learn that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. The transformation of a fearful farmer into a fearless leader demonstrates the power of divine appointment and anointing. The Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, enabling him to fulfill a purpose far beyond his natural abilities or inclinations. This encourages us that God's call on our lives comes with his enabling power. In a world that celebrates self-sufficiency and human achievement, Gideon's victory reminds us that our greatest strength lies in our dependence on God. The battle belongs to the Lord, and he delights in working through yielded vessels who acknowledge their inadequacy apart from him. True courage isn't the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward in obedience despite our fears, trusting in God's presence and promises. The legacy of Gideon continues to inspire believers facing overwhelming odds and impossible situations. His story encourages us to see our limitations not as obstacles to God's purposes, but as opportunities for his power to be displayed. When we feel insufficient for the tasks before us, we can remember the unlikely hero who threshed wheat in a winepress and ended up threshing the armies of Midian through faith in the living God. From fearful farmer to faithful warrior, Gideon's journey demonstrates how divine calling transforms ordinary individuals into instruments of extraordinary deliverance. His story reminds us that our true identity isn't determined by our own assessment or others' expectations, but by God's declaration over our lives. When the angel addressed Gideon as mighty warrior, he saw not merely what Gideon was, but what he would become through God's empowering presence. In the same way, God sees beyond our current circumstances to our future potential when we yield to his purposes. The peace that Israel enjoyed for 40 years following the Midianite defeat testifies to the far-reaching impact of one person's obedience. Though Gideon began his mission with doubt and hesitation, his willingness to follow God's unusual battle plan resulted in generational blessing. This encourages us that our acts of faith, however imperfect, can produce ripple effects of divine blessing that extend far beyond our immediate context or lifetime. In the end, Gideon's greatest victory wasn't over the Midianites but over his own fears and doubts. By trusting God's promise and following his instructions, this unlikely hero discovered that divine power flows most freely through those who acknowledge their weakness and depend entirely on heavenly resources. His story continues to call believers away from self-reliance toward the limitless possibilities that await those who place their trust in the God who turns ordinary people into mighty warriors for his kingdom.